Welcome to episode 3 of the Zech Support Legal Studies series. In today's episode, we're diving into mens rea, one of the most fundamental concepts in criminal law. Mens rea, or guilty mind, is the mental state that must accompany a criminal act for someone to be found guilty. Understanding intent, recklessness, negligence, and strict liability is crucial for grasping how the law determines criminal responsibility. By the end of this episode, you will know the difference between general intent and specific intent crimes, how the law distinguishes between negligence, recklessness, and intent, why motive is different from intent in criminal cases, what happens when intent transfers to unintended victims, how mens rea applies in different real-world legal cases, the role of mens rea in corporate and white-collar crimes, how different legal jurisdictions interpret mens rea differently, the role of mens rea in federal versus state criminal prosecutions, how historical legal cases shaped the modern understanding of mens rea. But we'll start by defining what mens rea is. At its core, mens rea refers to the mental state a defendant must have at the time they commit a crime. California Penal Code Section 20 states, "In every crime or public offense, there must exist a union or joint operation of act and intent." This means that criminal liability requires both a guilty act, or actus reus, and a guilty mind, mens rea. Mens rea can be further categorized based on the level of awareness and intent involved. These categories include personal conduct, knowledge, recklessness, and negligence. Each of these plays a different role in determining criminal liability. Now, let's break down the two main types of intent in criminal law: general intent and specific intent. A general intent crime is one where no specific mental state is required beyond a morally blameworthy act. The prosecution only has to prove that the defendant committed the act voluntarily. Here are some examples of general intent crimes. Battery. California Penal Code Section 242 defines battery as the unlawful and intentional use of force on another person. This includes touching someone in a harmful or offensive way, even if it doesn't cause injury. Elements of battery. The defendant intentionally touched another person. The force used was perceived as harmful or insulting. The defendant did not act in self-defense, in defense of someone else, or while reasonably disciplining a child. The punishments for battery include up to 6 months in county jail, a fine of up to $2,000, probation requiring community service, anger management, or restitution, a protective order restricting contact with the victim. Rape. California Penal Code 261 defines rape as non-consensual sexual intercourse with another person. It's a felony offense that can be punished by up to 8 years in a state prison, a fine of up to $10,000, formal probation, and registration as a sex offender for life. To be convicted of rape under California Penal Code 261, the prosecution must prove that the defendant had sexual intercourse with someone else without their consent. The defendant used force, violence, duress, menace, or fear of injury. The victim was incapable of giving legal consent. The victim was prevented from resisting by an intoxicating or anesthetic substance. Other types of rape, such as statutory rape, date rape, and spousal rape, have different penal codes. Factors that can increase penalties: if the victim was affected by great bodily injury, if the defendant used fraud, if the defendant threatened to use the authority of a public office. Arson. California Penal Code Section 451 defines arson as the intentional and malicious burning of property, structures, or forest land. It also includes aiding or encouraging others to burn property. Penalties: a fine of up to $10,000, a prison sentence of up to 9 years, both a fine and imprisonment, financial responsibility for damages caused by the fire, mandatory state registration as an arson offender, loss of the right to own firearms, civil lawsuits, employment loss, and restraining orders. Kidnapping. California Penal Code Section 207A defines kidnapping as the act of taking someone by force or fear and moving them a substantial distance without their consent. Kidnapping is a felony in California and can result in lengthy prison sentences. Elements of kidnapping: the defendant took, held, or detained another person. The defendant used force or fear to move the other person. The other person did not consent to the movement. The movement was substantial even if it was a short distance. Punishments for kidnapping: up to 11 years in state prison, a fine of up to $10,000, a strike on the defendant's criminal record. If the defendant has 3 strikes, they may be sentenced to at least 25 years in prison. Moving on to specific intent crimes. A specific intent crime requires that the defendant had a particular purpose or objective beyond just committing the act. The prosecutor must show that the defendant intended both the act and the result. Here are some examples of specific intent crimes. Burglary. California Penal Code 459 defines burglary as the act of entering a structure with the intent to commit a felony or theft. This includes entering a building, vehicle, or tent. Elements of burglary: entering a structure, room, or vehicle with the intent to commit a felony or theft. Forced entry is not required. Types of burglary. First-degree burglary, also known as residential burglary. This is when someone enters a residence to commit a felony or theft. This is a more serious crime than second-degree burglary. Second-degree burglary, also known as commercial burglary. This is when someone enters a business, store, or other building not used for living. Convictions for burglary can lead to jail time or prison sentences. First-degree murder. California Penal Code 187 defines the crime of murder as the unlawful killing of a human being or a fetus with malice aforethought. Essentially, it means that the killing was intentional and with a malicious mindset. What is malice aforethought? This means the perpetrator had the intent to kill or acted with conscious disregard for human life, which can be either expressed, clear intent to kill, or implied, actions that demonstrate a reckless disregard for life. There are varying degrees of murder. Under California law, murder can be classified as first-degree murder, premeditated and deliberate, or DWP, deliberate, willful, premeditated, or second-degree murder, intentional killing without premeditation. Forgery. According to California Penal Code 470, forgery is defined as the act of intentionally falsifying a signature, seal, or altering a document with the intent to defraud, which can include signing someone else's name without authorization, counterfeiting handwriting, or corrupting legal documents like wills or court records. This crime can be charged as either a misdemeanor or a felony depending on the circumstances. Embezzlement. California Penal Code 503 defines embezzlement as the crime of fraudulently taking property that has been entrusted to you. Elements of embezzlement: a fiduciary relationship. The defendant had a relationship of trust with the owner of the property. Intent: the defendant intended to take the property for themselves. Ownership: the defendant had lawful access to the property. Moving on now to levels of culpability: negligence, recklessness, and intent. Criminal negligence: failure to perceive a substantial and unjustifiable risk that a reasonable person would have noticed. An objective test: if a reasonable person in the defendant's position would have been aware of the risk, then the defendant is presumed to have been aware as well. An example would be involuntary manslaughter, Penal Code 192B. In California, involuntary manslaughter occurs when someone unintentionally kills another person due to criminal negligence. For instance, a mother leaves her infant in a hot car for hours, resulting in death. If a jury finds her conduct to be grossly negligent, she could be convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Another example: a doctor prescribes medication without reviewing patient history, leading to a fatal overdose. If their negligence is deemed criminal, they could be charged with manslaughter. Recklessness: a defendant acts recklessly when they are aware of a substantial risk but disregard it anyway. Example: a driver races through a red light in a school zone, knowing children are present. Even if they didn't intend to hit anyone, they knowingly ignored a serious risk. Here is a historical and comparative analysis of mens rea. The concept of mens rea has evolved over centuries. The common law approach to criminal intent differed significantly from the modern statutory framework used in the U.S. today. Common law evolution. Under early English law, criminal offenses often focused solely on actus reus. If someone committed an act, they were often found guilty regardless of intent. The modern concept of mens rea developed to ensure that only those with a culpable mental state are punished. Mens rea in different legal systems. United States versus European approaches. The U.S. criminal justice system places heavy emphasis on mens rea classifications, while some European legal systems focus more on the severity of the crime rather than the mental state. Strict liability in regulatory offenses. While the U.S. recognizes strict liability crimes, examples, environmental violations, food safety laws, other countries often require at least negligence for criminal liability. Here's a final recap of what we've learned today. Mens rea is the guilty mind required for criminal liability. There are different levels of intent, including negligence, recklessness, general intent, and specific intent. Strict liability crimes don't require intent, just the act itself is enough. Transferred intent holds defendants accountable when their intent results in unintended harm. Corporate crime also involves mens rea, especially in white-collar offenses. Historical perspectives and international comparisons show how mens rea has evolved over time. That's it for today's episode. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, stay on the right side of the law. And remember, when you need help, you can always call Zech Support.